Welcome to the skating lesson. I'm Jennifer Kirk.
And I'm Dave Lees. Today we are really excited to bring you another interview in our Olympian 360 series, an interview with Dr. Caroline Silby. Dr. Silby is a nationally renowned sports psychologist who specializes in ballet, gymnastics, and figure skating. She is a published author and a faculty member at American University. Dr. Silby has worked on an individual basis with 2 Olympic gold medalists, 12 Olympians, 3 world champions, and over 50 national competitors.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Silby. We're thrilled to have you on the skating lesson. We really appreciate it. So, my first question is, how does a skater know that he or she should seek out a sports psychologist? What's the typical scenario of a skater who comes to you? What do they say they've been experiencing on and off the ice?
So typically, clients get referred to me either by a coach or by the parent, most often because there's some kind of gap in performance level. So they're a little bit better in practice than they are in terms of when they compete. And so they want to try to kind of close that gap and more consistently be able to perform at their highest level. But what I will say is typically, performance issues, kind of performance inconsistency starts to happen anywhere from around 13 to 16. We don't really get a lot of referrals in that age range. I would love to see kids a little bit younger because we know that the onset of performance struggles kind of collides with the onset of adolescence. And so a lot of times I'm getting kids at 15, 16, 17 years old. But if we could provide them with strategies a little bit earlier so that we know that some of these issues they're going to be confronting, I think it would make the process be a lot smoother and more effective.
Being proactive. To that end, what's the number one mistake you see from skaters when it comes to mental preparation and the psychological aspect of training and performing?
The number one mistake typically is that when kids get frustrated in practice, that's kind of a great moment for or opportunity for athletes to really work on how they manage difficult emotions. And so typically what athletes do in those moments of frustration is they think harder and they try harder and they circle around. I always say they kind of sometimes look like a dog chasing their tails. I'm sure neither of you ever look like this, but you're doing the jump over and over and over again. And they're getting more and more and more frustrated and the anxiety is escalating. And so we actually want to use strategies that do the exact opposite, because when you talk to athletes about how they feel and what they're thinking and the actions that they're taking when they skate really well, you know the answer to this. They're going to say that their mind is actually very quiet. And so we actually need to kind of use more action-oriented strategies that allow kids a time to kind of what I call emotionally pivot in those moments and develop a different kind of tool set and different reactions and strategies than they might kind of gravitate towards naturally in those moments.
What would an example of something to do in that situation be? Say you're an adult skater and say maybe might miss your axle from time to time, and then your coach kind of gets on you a bit more, and maybe there's a little bit of yelling that happens, and then you might be gripping through your hair, and this might just happen from time to time, and you try harder and you throw. What should you do in that situation?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer of in those moments to immediately stop yourself, which is actually the last thing that we want to do. Because to reduce the anxiety, we think if we just keep going, we can somehow fight through it. But recognize and accept, and that's a huge word, accept. I'm frustrated. And you don't have to I think a lot of people get confused that they somehow have to be super positive, that in that moment they have to say, everything's really great. And I hear a lot of athletes kind of complain that that's the advice that they're given. And I'm not a believer in that. It's okay. You can say, I'm frustrated. I'm disappointed. This stinks. Or some other words that sometimes athletes use in those moments, and that's okay. The idea is that you can be frustrated and you can take positive action. And that's a really hard concept to understand because typically when we feel what I call kind of imperfect emotions, we tend to align our actions. So if I am feeling stressed, then therefore I have to do this and, you know, and I have to kind of drag my toe pick on the ice and I have to put my hands on my hips and kind of go through all the drama of acting out those kind of imperfect feelings. But the reality is you can feel imperfect and you can be okay. And that's what I try to really teach athletes. So in terms of like a specific strategy, I tend to go a very action-oriented approach. I'm going to want them to stop. We do a bunch of different strategies. I might have them count backward by sevens. I might have them do 1A, 2B, 3C, 4D, 5E, 6F, 7G, 8H. I'm really bad at it, but athletes can get really good at it because it starts to clear your mind. So what it does is it gets you mentally activated and alert, but it doesn't allow you, if you're doing 1A, 2B, 3C, you can't be obsessing over the jump you just missed. So it directs your focus into a different place. And then the power pose is just a beautiful strategy, which is that the research is kind of showing that when we put ourselves in power position, so I'm sitting, so a power pose seated is this, if I were to sit back, yeah, and if I were to put my feet up on the desk, that's like the ultimate power pose. But if you're standing, that's right, see, now you have to see, Dave, if your brain does anything different. Because what the research shows is that when you put yourself in power positions, your cortisol level, which is the stress hormone, comes down and testosterone goes up. And this is like the ideal state for performance, right? So I don't know, do you feel any different?
You do. You feel kind of more relaxed and baller almost.
Yeah, I don't know to what levels. I'm kind of thinking, but when you open yourself up and take up as much space as possible with your body, you do feel empowered. So now think about kids before they compete. What do you usually see right before an athlete steps on the ice?
I feel like you huddle with your coach before you compete. You know,
This is it. They're cold, right? So you're kind of this, the shoulders come up. Okay, this is not a power pose position. So the first thing you want to do is get kids to start to open up, especially kind of in that time period between the warm-up and the 6-minute warm-up and when they perform. There should be some, you see people pacing, you know, and very often, again, you see them not...
Like hands on the hips, eyes down, yeah.
Yeah, so kind of open up again and taking up as much room with your body because that's what you're going to do when you're out on the ice. So you want to simulate that a little bit beforehand. And you can do the same thing in practice. So when a coach is yelling at you, telling you you're not trying, you know, you're desperately trying up here in your head because there's nothing more that you want to do than hit the next jump. But they're reading your body language to a certain extent, you know, which is a lot of times this kind of stuff. And so open up and change that position. And even if you're still not believing that you can do it, your body is set and ready to give you a shot at it.
Interesting.
Well, speaking about perfection, one of the things that often comes with perfectionism is an overwhelming feel of failure. And it, you know, so happens that a lot of perfectionists are high achievers, but their fear of failure becomes extremely strong. So how do you teach skaters to overcome that?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm giving kind of some evasive answers because these are really big questions. So I don't mean to be evasive in my answers. So I'll kind of tell you a lot of times where I start because I think you're exactly right on target that our sport attracts a perfectionistic personality because to a certain extent there are some positives to perfectionism that really work well in our sport, especially if you want to achieve at the highest levels. So the idea is really to take the parts that sometimes what happens with perfectionism where it goes in more of a interfering kind of direction is when things are taken to the extreme. So for instance, if you look at some of the qualities of a perfectionist, setting high goals, having high standards for yourself, okay, necessary for achievement, absolutely. But when it becomes kind of a detriment to performance is when those goals become so narrow that nothing is acceptable it's kind of like, I always describe it, it's kind of like trying to hit a tiny, tiny, tiny little target that you can barely see. And it becomes so overwhelmingly stressful to try to hit that tiny little target. But if you open that up a little bit you have a broader range set of experiences from which you can feel competent and satisfied and all the things in control, all the things that we want to feel when we're involved in a sport. So kind of opening up that, and I call it a range of good. I like athletes to kind of set goals that from their best to kind of acceptable. And typically when athletes are falling within that range, they're performing consistently. And then what you try to do is move it more to their high end of good and get their performance levels more often kind of towards that best to good range. But what you see is that as athletes get to higher and higher and higher levels, the goal, and Jenny, you probably experienced this, the goal narrows more and more and more. Mm-hmm. And so then there become hardly any experiences that make you feel good. So now a great triple Lutz, triple toe, oh, I should have done it on the first try. It's no longer a great triple Lutz, triple toe, but it's still a triple Lutz, triple toe that you did really well, and you don't have very much left to learn.
Right.
You know, what are you going to learn? You're going to learn a triple axel, maybe a quad. You know, so there's not that much left to learn that you can, so you've got to learn how to take credit for experiences, even if they're repetitive ones, kind of at those highest levels. And then the other thing, just kind of along with perfectionism, is that I always find it kind of interesting that, so perfectionists tend to be highly motivated people. So if you think of motivation on a continuum, and here's like someone who's undermotivated, not motivated at all. And then here's someone who's like completely motivated. Most skaters fall kind of on this end of the continuum, or at least kind of this higher achieving skaters that we're talking about. So I always find it funny that when an athlete on this end of the continuum tries to motivate themselves, they actually try to motivate themselves by telling themselves, no, this is super important. I better do it. If I don't do it, this is going to be awful. It's going to be the end of the world. My career is over. I'm not going to be able to make the international team. I'm not going to get my second selection. I'm going to fall out of the envelope, whatever it is that's going through their head, right? That's how they're trying to motivate themselves. And I always say, but you're on this end of the continuum. Where's your motivation going to go? You're already the most motivated you can be. So all that does is move you the other direction. Now, this person who's completely unmotivated, you tell this person it's super important and you better kick your butt into gear here, that person now increases motivation. So it is a little bit about understanding who you are, kind of personality-wise, and then fitting the training environment to kind of help move that forward or fit that.
Well, you often see skaters, obviously, when they're having some sort of a problem. And we interviewed Dan Hollander earlier this year, and he discussed how he saw a sports psychologist when he was having a lot of problems with performance, and then he started skating well. And I think people do this with regular therapists, too. We come to you when we have a problem. We then feel better. The visits taper off because we don't feel like we have as much to talk about. And then maybe things start creeping back in. So when you start working with a skater, do they need to start coming with you for regular checkup visits, and even when they're doing well? And are there stuff that they can implement on their own, even if they do stop visits? I mean, because obviously you see them when there's a problem, so hopefully they're doing well. What do you do at that point? Right,
yeah. We always, in the sports psychology business, we always kind of tease each other that we're really in the business of working ourselves out of jobs. Because you want your clients, obviously, to not want to really come back and see you at some level. But I think that you have to do all of the things that you referred to. I actually prefer to see athletes when they're skating really well because we don't tend to take those opportunities to really learn from them. And one of the biggest areas that I try to work on with athletes is making the connection between the actions that they take and their positive results. So if you ask an athlete, tell me about a time you skated really great, they will tell you, and they will describe it in full detail if you want them to. And then my next question is, okay, now I want you to tell me one action that you took that contributed to that positive result. And do you know what their answer is 9 times out of 10?
What? I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah, it makes it feel like it's out of your control. Yeah.
They say they don't know. Right. It just happened. So I said, okay, so how are we supposed to get you to perform consistently if you haven't even defined one action that you take when you perform well? So I like to get it to at least 3 actions that they define, that they know that they do. It's not a guarantee, but it empowers them to start to be in, as you said, Jen, in control of your performance as opposed to just showing up and winging it. So when people perform really well, I don't necessarily always hear about it with my clients directly from them, but I will reach out, typically, let's set a time, let's talk. I want to walk through that and talk about how that went, because typically when people perform well, the research shows that they just assume that they have all the information they need, but the reality is they don't, because they don't really know what information to look for, and kind of what to pull out in terms of how to learn from that success. So I like to see them and talk to them when performance goes well. Yes, we kind of tend to taper off when they feel like the strategies are working and strategies are in place, but there's always check-ins, and then there's also always exercises, whether that's through self-reflection kind of prompts that I'll send them to kind of use as almost like a journal so that they can reflect. It depends upon kind of where they are and what kinds of areas that they'd like to continue to strengthen. But I think a lot of athletes don't take the time to identify what their strengths are, and how we can use those strengths more consistently to get the performance outcomes that they want.
Well, obviously, figure skating is a judge sport, as well as gymnastics and diving and many others. And along with that comes a lot of criticism. I think after these national championships, we all remember Ashley Wagner responding to some of the criticisms on Twitter about her skating because she was getting inundated with comments that she didn't deserve her national title. So as a sports psychologist, how do you, approach this with your athletes to not allow the negative comments to affect their performance?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a hard one, because my advice is stay off the internet, which is not very good advice. Or it's good advice, but it's not implementable these days. So it is very difficult. I think that at the higher levels, you have to accept that there's going to be criticism. And at the same time, I think you need to consider that information and that feedback with what you know to be true. And what you're as the athlete and kind of the athlete's core team surrounding him or her, those are the people that truly know what the goals are and also understand the methodical process of getting there. So the outside people, as well-intentioned as they may be, they're just looking for great performance all the time, that they can rave about. And anybody, you all know this, anybody who's been in skating knows that doesn't happen. Even at the very, very highest levels and the best skaters, it just doesn't happen all of the time. And so the fans, so to speak, that are kind of writing a lot of that, there's going to be criticisms, because if their expectation is that somebody's going to go out and perform to their best every time, it's not going to that expectation is probably not going to be met. And so I think the athlete really has to keep in mind what their own goals are and kind of that methodical way that they're going about it. When they start to get sidetracked and get off that path is when, I just call it noise. It's when you start responding to all the noise instead of what you know to be the right path and the right actions, and you being your team, the core people that are putting together your game plan. And, when they did a survey of Olympic athletes, they asked them what was the greatest mistake that you made. Actually, I think the survey was of coaches, and the coaches said the greatest mistake we made was we strayed from our game plan. And so I think you've got to be very consistent and very diligent about knowing what your plan is and then sticking to it, even when all the noise is present. The other term that I use sometimes that athletes kind of find a little bit humorous, I think, is I call a lot of that stuff, all the stuff that goes on at Twitter, a TBU. So it may be true that you skated awful, but it's a completely useless piece of information in terms of what you need to do moving forward. At least the other person's, obviously you're going to learn from that experience. But what they're saying, it's a TBU. You can't respond to every comment that's made about you, but it is something that those higher level athletes really have to learn how to navigate.
So true, and it's hard even with us. We get emails sometimes from our show from well-meaning fans, but it's a little it's hard to forget about this. So my next question is, how important is visualization? Because I remember a story from, I think it was the 2006 Olympics, where Evan Lysacek came down with the stomach flu the day of the long program, and he couldn't practice. He had to spend the entire day in his hotel room, but he said that he visualized himself skating a clean performance for the whole day, and that's exactly what happened that night when he went out to compete. Debbie Thomas talked about similar experiences when she was a guest on our show. So how important is one's mind? How big of a role does visualization play in a skater's success? And how do you tell skaters to approach visualization? Is it something where they should do it every day at the same time in the same place? Or is it a tool that can just be utilized the day of an event?
Yeah, so visualization is probably one of the most kind of researched and discussed strategies that sports psychologists make use of to improve performance, be that when you're trying to learn a new element or when you're getting ready to perform or compete. Sometimes it's called imagery, sometimes it's called mental rehearsal. So the research does show that people who practice or athletes that practice and do imagery do better than athletes who just practice. But with that said, imagery, you have to be careful because some kids are just not visual people. And it can be a frustrating process, especially at first, for them to kind of learn how to do it. And if the athlete, I'm a big believer, if this is one more thing that you're giving an athlete to do for their skating that they feel like is a have to do, then it's not going to be effective or helpful. So I think you have to kind of check out and understand kind of the whole situation in terms of giving athletes strategies like a visualization. Now, what they say, if you are going to use visualization, kind of the key factor in its effectiveness is how vivid a picture you can create in your mind. So the more, if I'm picturing being on the show, the more I can see the colors, your bright pink and the red and the stripes and, kind of get a feel for what the smells are. Like all rinks kind of have smells, if you can kind of relate to what that smell would be like, and the sounds in the arena and kind of how your foot feels in your skate. So you try to use as many senses as possible. Then the imagery tends to be a little bit more effective. And my preference is to have people to practice it on an ongoing basis, as opposed to just using it right before they compete. If people use it right before they compete, a lot of times they'll just see themselves mess up over and over again, and then that becomes a pretty scary process. And then they'll say, I can't even see myself doing it right in my head. How am I going to do it when I get out there? And so it's better for them to practice that and 3 times a week. It doesn't take long. The other kind of rule of thumb that I give athletes is do it with your music while you're listening to the music, because it actually sounds very simple to pace, to like when you're doing your visualization, it should be paced about the same time as real time. But what ends up happening, if you've ever tried to pace something, it's actually very difficult to do. So people do their imagery without the music, and for a short program, they'll be done in a minute. And so all they've done is rush through everything. So it's just easier, listen to your music so that you can stay pacing, and then whatever kind of key points or mental pacing of the program that you're using, you would practice that as well with the visualization.
Smart. Well, even though so much time has passed and all of this research has come out, often when a skater announces that they're working with a sports psychologist, you hear whispers in the skating world that the skater has been labeled, for lack of a better phrase, a head case. So how can we start to destigmatize mental health and educate skating fans, skaters, that getting help from a sports psychologist is just like going to a physical therapist or an off-ice trainer? It's just another skill that skaters can utilize.
No, I think it's a great point. There is still, I think we've come a long way. I can remember when I skated and I was just an unbelievably inconsistent performer, and I had asked my parents, I said, there's got to be something you can do with your head to make your body work better. And they just kind of looked at me like, you've got to be kidding. We don't know what that is. And they did some research, and, back then it was a much newer field than it certainly is today. And, the way I frame it is I always ask athletes when I do a workshop, how much of your skating do you feel is affected by your attitude and how you think about things? And they usually tell you, depending upon how experienced the athlete is, they're going to tell you anywhere between 50 and 99.9% of what they do is affected by their attitude. So then the next question I ask them is, well, how much time each day do you spend working on your attitude? And they laugh, right? Because it's like 0%. And then, there's always somebody's hand that goes, I spend a lot of time, and great, what do you do? I don't know. I don't know what I do. I just feel like I spend a lot of time doing it. So there's this idea that we should just know how to do it. And we throw words out to kids like focus. We've all throughout our lifetime been told, get focused. And we know what it means, but it doesn't mean that we have a systematic way of going about doing that. So I think, again, for me, it's all initially, and whenever I talk with parents, I kind of tell them this. For me, it's about looking at performance, coming from a very positive direction and showing kids, look, you know something about your performance. You just don't know what you know. So let's figure out what you do know, and then let's implement strategies to make those actions and those things happen more often, especially when there's a lot of noise and especially when doubt hits, because doubt will come. It may not come for the juvenile skater, or it might come for the juvenile skater, but it will come at some point in time. And that first time, I don't know if either of you remember the first time you had doubt when you skated, but the first time it hits you and you have this realization of, oh my gosh, I'm not sure I can do this. It feels like you're the only person in the world who is experiencing doubt in that moment. And the reality is it's not. And so that's what I always say to parents and when I'm out doing workshops is we know there are certain kind of, I don't know what you want to call them, developmental milestones that sometimes interfere with performance in skating. So for instance, every skater who calls me who's circling and popping thinks they're the only skater in the world who's circling and popping. Okay, every skater circles and pops, except for the two of you, I'm sure. But
oh, never.
So we know there are certain things. People go through these stages of performance inconsistency, and it almost has to happen for them to figure out what they do to perform well. So there are these, like I said, these milestones that we know that they're going to hit. And so I think it's kind of interesting that if we could just be proactive about it and say, okay, this is the common set. This doesn't mean that you're not a good skater. This doesn't mean that you're not getting to where you want to be. It's just a part of the sport. At some point, you're going to be avoidant of a jump, and you're going to feel the pressure to land it, and you're going to circle some, or you're going to pop. It's going to happen. And so let's understand what that is, and then let's devise some strategies to try to manage your way through that as effectively as possible. So I think it's understanding what sports psychology really is all about and what sports psychology addresses. And that it is, a lot of people now get rid of the kind of term sports psychology and just call it mental training for that exact reason. That we just need your mind to be connected to your body, because when that disconnect happens, performance is finished.
Well, you talk about the mind being connected to the body, and one topic we really wanted to hit with you was the topic of burnout, because skating is extremely physically draining, but it's also mentally extremely draining, especially at the end of a season, training a program for so long. So how do you deal with burnout as opposed to having active rest, passive rest, sending someone to Tahiti for a while to come down? And how do you know when you're just burnt out or you need a break versus you need to think about hanging it up? And how do you tell the difference between that with burnout?
So burnout typically occurs when it starts to feel like you're banging your head against the wall, so that you feel as though you're getting over and over and over and over again, you're not getting the results that you want. And performance, there's kind of a decrement in performance. People that are just stressed feel overwhelmed yet hopeful that things can change and that they can be empowered to change things. Burned out people actually feel completely helpless, that it will never change. And so there is a fairly big difference in terms of athletes that present with just stress as opposed to burnout. And typically the burned out athlete is questioning at that point their commitment to the sport, which really then is part of the whole difficulty of getting through the burnout. Because think about that. If you're frustrated on a daily basis about the results that you're getting, and every time, you miss your double lutz, or double axel, that now takes you down this path of having to think about whether you even want to continue in the sport. And then if you don't continue in the sport, what does that mean about your identity? Because you're a skater. And what would I do if I didn't skate? And what would my life look like then? Now, meanwhile, you're still out on the ice trying to do a double axel, right? And you're thinking about these huge, right? And
I've so been there.
Yeah. Yeah, so it becomes completely overwhelming. And so you need to really, with burnout, there's a couple things. You need to help athletes get reconnected to how they want to feel when they skate. So I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, which is that we all want to be involved in activities that make us feel a certain way about ourselves. Free, empowered, in control, satisfied, competent, social. And so not that you're going to feel all of those things every time you get on the ice, but on a daily basis, you might feel at least one of those things and be able to connect to the moment when you felt it. Athletes, when they get burned out, are feeling typically the opposite. They're very disconnected from any of the things that they want to feel. They become extremely result driven. And the more they focus on the result and the fact that they're not getting the result, the more disconnected they come from what I would call these feeling goals. And so you really have to take them back to kind of reconnect to what actions can you take on a daily basis to feel in control, competent, satisfied, and kind of reframe it for them. And then you also have to work on this piece, like I said, that they can't be navigating and questioning their commitment to the sport and trying to work through it at the same time. One or the other has to happen, which is why sometimes with burnout, people go to Tahiti or take time off, because they need to kind of separate themselves from that. But if you're going to take time off, a lot of time the mistake is made is that then athletes come back in without any new coping strategies, and they're coming right back into the same environment and same situation. So you need to, if you're going to go to Tahiti, it would be good to do some mindfulness training or some relaxation and imagery or develop a tool set so that when you come back, you feel like you can be empowered to deal with the situation in a very different manner. So, but burnout, it's a great, it's a terrific question that you asked, because I think, again, that's one of those situations that we wait a little too long. It'll get better. And we tend to manage burnout from competition to competition rather than kind of navigating it earlier when we start to see some signs when it's just stress. We should get in there when it's stress before it moves to burnout.
Well, I think this is wonderful. It's going to help so many skaters. So thank you so much, Dr. Silby, for sharing so much of your insight and knowledge and spending so much time with us today. We really appreciate it.